student. A lot of courage to come up in the room and share your voice. Historically, this would be a night during my comment time in which I would talk about the opening of school. I'd share how wonderful it was to have students and staff back and all the smiling faces. I'd talk about my first day of school riding the bus and the caring driver's interaction with students and families and all the mutual appreciation from the community excited to be back in school. And all of that is true, by the way. Those things happened. We really did have a strong opening to school thanks to the preparation and hard work of all of our staff, our students, and our families. But that reality was and is overshadowed for many by the 2 weapons incidents at Capitol High School. Those incidents not only took away the opportunity for many of our students and staff's ability to fully enjoy the start of school, but it evoked understandable fear, anger, and anxiety, many of those things we heard tonight in this room. And we've heard a lot more from the community over the last several days in other forums. Every parent, students, and educators' worst fear is a shooting at school. Thankfully, that didn't happen. It didn't happen in part because we have emergency procedures in place. We practice them. We encourage people to say something if they see something of concern. We're vigilant and observant at school, and when needed, we work with our partners in the Olympia Police Department to mitigate threats. Those things did happen. It wasn't perfect. And we can always improve on our responses and our communications, and there was good feedback, additional feedback tonight about that. But given the eventual outcomes with no one physically hurt, I was extremely grateful. I know you all were too. We practice a cycle of improvement. Something happens, we take action based on our preparation, we review it, we collect data, we reflect on that action, we determine what improvements need to be made, and then we take steps to get better. And in this instance, we're asking ourselves, how can we better ensure that our students and staff are safe? How do we make our schools safer? And the big question that's facing us tonight, although there's a lot of other really good suggestions, is does resuming a school district police officer program, is that an appropriate step in the direction of making things safer? I'm a former middle school and high school administrator. And in all places where I worked, we had SROs. And for the most part, had pretty good experiences. But we've learned a lot since I held those positions about the effectiveness of school officer programs in actually preventing violence. And there's a variance of opinions by students, families, and even staff on whether such a program increases a sense of belonging or safety. There is a lot of national data about how in some cases police officers get involved in what would normally be considered just regular behavior issues in school, and sometimes those result in arrests. And data shows that when that happens, it disproportionately impacts students of color, students with disabilities, and it contributes to that school-to-prison pipeline. Data has also shown that when actual shootings take place on campuses, we heard it from some of our commenters tonight, it often happens at schools where SROs were actually in place, like Uvalde and Parkland. That should be strongly considered. And I think we should also look closely at our local data. What's happened here in Olympia with our program? I think that's super, super important. I don't know, and we'll never know, if having an SRO at Capitol High School would have prevented weapons from being brought on campus this last week. And it's hard for me to imagine the response by staff and OPD being much quicker or better than it actually was. I don't believe that school officer programs are the answers to so many pressing issues facing our youth, like the availability and access to guns, or the increase in depression and anxiety, and now that suicide is the second leading cause of death for adolescents, oftentimes by gun. All of that being said, I actually do believe that the resumption of some sort of formal partnership between the school district and police department could be beneficial for us. And many of our principals agree with me. Not all our principals, but many do. The reason I believe this has less to do with stopping what happened the first few days of school at Capitol High School, but more to do with the ever-increasing number of situations that come into our schools that our administrative and counseling teams are just not equipped to handle. Too often, there's a threatening social media post that paralyzes the school community because it goes viral. And it takes cooperation with police who can get out, go off campus, investigate the veracity of that post, oftentimes involving guns, that allows the principals to assure families that a threat has been deemed not viable. They provide immediate support in child abuse, sexual assault, domestic violence situations, really tricky custody disputes that sometimes get violent. They are able to expedite and coordinate community support systems to support our students and ensure their safety. And without an officer dedicated to our schools that we can work with, sometimes, not always, we end up in the 911 queue. Especially if those situations are not, well, they might be urgent, but they don't pose a large-scale threat. The concern that not all members of our community feel safer when an officer is in our schools has to be heard and has to be understood. I'm more prone to believe that an officer program could be beneficial because now, today, it's required to be different than in the past because of new state laws. RCW, the law 28A 321-24 that was passed in 2019 and revised in 2021 prohibits school resource officers from becoming involved in regular school discipline. It requires a formal complaint process for families. It focuses on safety and security staff being engaged in creating a positive school climate and positive relationships with students. It asks for community involvement in the hiring process. And it says that every officer has to be properly trained. And when you talk about training, like many said tonight, the Office of Superintendent of Public Instruction was tasked with providing that training for any prospective school officer to go along with that law. And that school training, officer training program has 12 mandated training topics. And these are those topics. Constitutional and civil rights of children in schools, including state laws governing search and interrogation of youth. Training on child and adolescent development. Training on trauma-informed approaches to working with youth. Recognizing and responding to youth with mental health issues. Educational rights of students with disabilities. The relationship of disability to behavior and best practices for interacting with students with disabilities. The training requires training on collateral consequences of arrest. Referral for prosecution and court involvement. Training on resources available in the community that serve as alternatives to arrest, and prosecution and pathways for youth to access services without criminal justice involvement. Training on local and national disparities in the use of force and arrests of children that was talked about tonight. Training on de-escalation techniques when working with youth or groups of youth. And they have to have training on the state law regarding restraint and isolation in schools, bias-free policing, cultural competency, best practices for interacting with students from particular backgrounds, including English learners, LGBTQ youth, and immigrants, and on the Federal Educational Rights and Privacy Act. The law says staff need to have this training within 6 months of coming on board. But I've heard us, when we were talking about this before, that we wouldn't say 6 months is okay. It needs to be in place, I would say, before anybody steps into our schools, or they don't go. As we've continued from our recovery from COVID, we pledged that we wouldn't go back to normal, but rather that we would take what we've learned and we would come back better. I think we can do that with school safety. It's not easy, but I think we can do this and be stronger and more effective. Thank you, President Hoffman.
Thank you, Superintendent Murphy.